your word is secure, forever settled in the heavens, that it is infallible, inspired, and God, that it is authoritative, Lord, for all matters of life today. Lord, I pray that we would adhere to the principle of sola scriptura, and Lord, that our only authority would be your word. Thank you for this beautiful evening you've given to us. And Father, thank you for those who've come out tonight to study your word. Pray that you give us clarity. And Father, I pray that we would leave here with a, Lord, more clear understanding of your word and our faith strengthened so that we can be bold to share it with others. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Hey, I appreciate Pastor Scott last week filling in for me while I was gone. And he covered a lot of passages in Leviticus, correct? Leviticus and Numbers. And tonight we're going to finish up Numbers and get into Deuteronomy and finish up with a pretty controversial passage. But we got some we got to cover before then. If you have your Bibles or your digital Bible, which, by the way, you know the digital Bible is not as inspired as the printed page. Just we need to make that clear. No, I'm kidding. Numbers chapter 35, okay, beginning in verse 9. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall select for yourselves cities to be your cities of refuge, that the manslayer who has killed any person unintentionally may flee there. The city shall be to you as a refuge from the avenger, so that the manslayer will not die until he stands before the congregation for trial. The cities which you are to give shall be your 6 cities of refuge. You shall give 3 cities across the Jordan, and 3 cities in the land of Canaan. They are to be cities of refuge. These 6 cities shall be for refuge for the sons of Israel, and for the alien, and for the sojourner among them." Notice that the law applied equally to everybody, so that anyone who kills a person unintentionally may flee there. And then he's going to go through some more scenarios here. "But if he struck him down with an iron object so that he died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. If he struck him down with a stone in the hand by which he will die, and as a result he died, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. Or if he struck him with a wooden object in the hand by which he might die, and as a result he died, he is a murderer." That is, if he's wounded, but doesn't die immediately, but eventually dies, he's a murderer. He shall surely be put to death. "The blood avenger himself shall put the murderer to death. He shall put him to death when he meets him. If he pushed him of hatred or threw something at him lying in wait, and as a result he died, or if he struck him down with his hand in enmity, and as a result he died, the one who struck him shall surely be put to death. He is a murderer. The blood avenger shall put the murderer to death when he meets him." Now let me just clear up what a blood avenger is. A blood avenger in Old Testament times would have been some capable person in the family who is appointed by the family to go get justice for the victim. That's what the blood avenger was. "But if he pushed him suddenly without enmity, or threw something at him without lying in wait, or with any deadly object of stone, and without seeing it dropped on him so that he died, while he was not his enemy, nor seeking his injury, then your congregation shall judge between the slayer and the blood avenger according to these ordinances. The congregation shall deliver the manslayer from the hand of the blood avenger, and the congregation shall restore him to his city of refuge to which he fled, and he shall live in it until the death of the high priest who was anointed with the holy oil. But if the manslayer at any time goes beyond the border of his city of refuge to which he may flee, and the blood avenger finds him outside the border of his city of refuge, and the blood avenger kills the manslayer, he will not be guilty of blood, because he should have remained in his city of refuge until the death of the high priest. But after the death of the high priest, the manslayer shall return to the land of his possession." So the problem here is, do these verses somehow contradict God's command in the 10 Commandments to not murder? The answer, of course, is no. And that's because murder is the intentional taking of an innocent human life. There has to be intent, otherwise it is not murder. In cases where a person is killed unintentionally or accidentally, the one who was responsible for the killing had to flee to one of the 6 cities of refuge. They were Kadesh, Shechem, Hebron, Bezer, Ramoth, and Golan. These cities were strategically placed throughout Israel for easy access. The killer would go to one of those cities and request asylum and protection from the avenger of blood who was appointed by the family to exact justice. The priest would then protect him until the matter could be adjudicated. If they found his story to be credible, then he had to remain in the city until the death of the high priest. He could not be touched. But if he chose to leave the city, he was on his own and he could be the victim then of a reprisal killing. It is important in these verses to know the difference between murder and killing. Manslaughter, accidental death, killing in self-defense, killing in time of war is not the same as murder. Now, obviously, you talk to combat veterans who've come back from recent wars, and I've had the privilege of counseling many of them. They'll tell you that even killing in time of war, it affects you for the rest of your life. It's not a light thing to take a human life, even if you're acting under orders in a combat life or death situation. It still affects you. You kill somebody accidentally. There's going to be legal ramifications for that. Monetary, possible prison time. You kill somebody driving. There's going to be legal ramifications for that. We see all of that tied in here with the Levitical law, the law of God. Even in a case where a guy did not intend to kill somebody, if he killed somebody, he pretty much had to be confined to that city of refuge. If the high priest was old and was about ready to kick the bucket, he wouldn't have to spend very much time there. But if the guy had just been appointed a high priest, this is essentially a life sentence. And so the principle here is that life is sacred, and obviously murder is absolutely categorically forbidden. But even in cases where you take a human life, don't kid yourself, there are consequences. A few weeks ago when we touched on this in the sermon, a young man came up to me, and this young man hadn't been a Christian very long, but he's had a pretty rough life in his past. And he said, "Pastor, I got to ask you this question." And he referred to his past life, and he goes, I've had to kill somebody who was trying to kill me. Am I okay? And I said, "Yeah, if you killed him in self-defense." He goes, I really feel terrible about it, but he was trying to kill me. And the Bible makes a distinction between that. But even in Bible days, there still had to be consequences for the good of the manslayer. Okay, any questions about that? Any questions? Okay, so if you've killed somebody and you're keeping it under wraps, then just come talk to me afterwards and I'll help you feel. If you murdered somebody, well, then you need to make that right with God. But it's always the quiet ones that I'm worried about, That's what it is. All right, Numbers chapter 35, verse 30, kind of continuing the same discussion. If anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death at the evidence of witnesses, plural. But no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. Now here, the American justice system gets this wrong. That is, you can put someone to death in our legal system on the testimony of just one witness. Now, executions or capital punishments few and far between in this country, but as we're going to look at this, we don't. I'm pro death penalty, but we don't carry this out correctly. Now we have people sitting on our death row here in Nebraska. I think we have 11 or 12 on death row now. None of them even contest their own guilt. They're guilty. It is beyond any doubt they're guilty. Why they have been allowed to live on death row as long as they have is beyond me. But you cannot put somebody to death under God's law on just one eyewitness. Let's read on. Moreover, you shall not take ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. You shall not take a ransom for him who has fled to a city of refuge, that he may return to live in the land before the death of the high priest. So you shall not pollute the land in which you live in, so that you should not pollute, I lost my place. So you shall not pollute the land in which you are, for blood pollutes the land, and no expiation can be made for the land for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell, for I, the Lord, am dwelling in the midst of the sons of Israel. So the problem here is eyewitness testimony required for a murder conviction which leads to the death penalty? And the answer is yes. Now, other evidence may be considered in determining the guilt or innocence of the accused murderer, but in order to put someone to death, there has to be at least 2 eyewitnesses. You see, the Bible establishes a very high standard for the death penalty in these cases because the image of God in man is sacred. Because of the imago Dei, or the image of God, it is better to let a guilty man go free than to execute the innocent. Now, in our time, that means that most of the people sitting on death row would be facing life in prison. In the case of school shooters and, say, the theater massacre in Aurora back in 2012, the death penalty would not be optional in those cases, but mandatory because there were multiple eyewitnesses. And in the Bible, it also, in addition to not being optional but rather mandatory, it also was carried out immediately, meaning they didn't linger around on death row, sucking up the taxpayers' money, giving interviews, writing books, and getting famous. There was none of that. There was a very high standard for the death penalty. But that doesn't mean that other evidence couldn't be used to determine guilt. It just means you can't execute somebody on circumstantial evidence. And by some of these other means of evidence, we're talking about DNA and fingerprints. DNA can be planted at the scene, which is why I still think that in a murder case that leads to the death penalty, there needs to be eyewitnesses. Fingerprints are circumstantial. These do not satisfy the biblical standard for the death penalty. Now, what about video? Does video take the place of eyewitnesses? I would say yes, just so long as it's cross-examined by a third party to prove that it was. I mean, right now you can fake people's images on video. You know that, don't you? So it gets pretty complex. Probably it's safe to say that we need to stick with the eyewitness testimony. So if you're ever on a jury in a murder trial, you probably need to let the judge or whoever's screening jurors that, if you believe in the death penalty, you believe in the biblical standard. Not saying that's going to get you out of jury duty, but it might. Now, the other crimes that the Bible prescribes the death penalty for also has to meet the standard of multiple eyewitnesses. 2 in the least, preferably 3 or more. Because the more eyewitnesses you have, the more credible the guilt is, the more credible the guilt can be established. Okay, any questions about that? I know it's a big issue among Christians, should we be pro-death penalty or not? I mean, I think if it hits the biblical standard of eyewitness testimony, then I think it's okay, and I think it should be. I think in cases of murder, I think it definitely should be. Cases of rape, human trafficking, being a Colorado Buffalo fan, one of those things. I mean, other serious crimes like that. But I don't think that you are violating the law of God. Thou shalt not commit murder if you're for the death penalty. It's just the standard has to be pretty high. Now, if you look at the number of people sitting on death row right now who were convicted with basically non-eyewitness testimony. Not saying those people still shouldn't be in jail, but I'm just saying they shouldn't be sitting on death row. I'd have to check on that. I'd have to go back and look at the law of God and see what it actually says. I don't want to give you the wrong answer, but if you between now and the end of the lesson, if you can find chapter and verse on that, share it with us. No, I'm serious. It's not coming to me offhand. Yeah, it's not coming to me offhand, but I mean, it could very well be the case. I know in Roman times, under the Roman law system, women were not allowed to testify, which makes the story of the resurrection that much more credible. Because if you're concocting this story, you're going to start with two eyewitnesses that are definitely going to hold up under judicial scrutiny. I mean, if you're the disciples and you're making up the story of the resurrection, you're going to name as your eyewitnesses Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. Two guys who were close to Jesus, who were Nicodemus was part of the Jewish Supreme Court. Well respected. Same with Joseph of Arimathea. Well respected. You're going to start with those guys. You're not going to start with two women who can't even testify in court. That's why we know the story wasn't concocted, because they related the facts as they actually were. Okay? Any other questions? Well, once again, I think the standard always has to be multiple eyewitnesses.
So they would still just
Yeah,
fly under the radar.
yeah. I think they would. I mean, obviously we don't live in a time when the avenger of blood is something we practice. You know, you got to understand the governmental structure in Israel was not what we have today. We have multiple layers of law enforcement. So it's never right to go and get vengeance. You know, even if somebody were to take the life of a dear friend, that's never right. We have to let the law work its way out. But far too many people get far too many chances. We got way too many people walking the streets who are very dangerous. And there again, if we value the image of God and humanity, we have to always err on the side of protecting innocent human life. And we don't put people to death without the testimony, the credible testimony of two or more eyewitnesses, for the same reason, because we value the image of God in man. But yeah. All right, let's move on. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 10 through 15. Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when the Lord said to me, assemble the people to me, that I may let them hear my words, so they may learn to fear me all the days they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children. You came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire to the very heart of the heavens, darkness, cloud, and thick gloom. Then the Lord spoke to you from the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but you saw no form, only a voice. So he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, that is, the 10 Commandments, and he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. The Lord commanded me at that time to teach you statutes and judgments, so that you might perform them in the land where you are going over to possess it. So watch yourself carefully, since you did not see any form on the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb from the midst of fire. Where was the law given? What mountain? Mount Sinai. Here it says it's at Mount Horeb. So the question is, was the law given to Moses at Mount Sinai or at Mount Horeb? This is really an easy answer. Both names refer to the same location. Denali in Alaska is the highest mountain in North America. Anybody know its name that it was referred to for years? Mount McKinley. So it's both Mount McKinley and Denali. It's the same thing. Okay? Shouldn't be a whole lot of questions about that. All right. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 26. You shall surely tithe all the produce from what you sow, which comes out of the field every year. You shall eat in the presence of the Lord your God at the place where he chooses to establish his name, the tithe of your grain, your new wine, your oil, and the firstborn of your herd and your flock, so that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. If the distance is so great for you that you are not able to bring the tithe, since the place where the Lord your God chooses to set his name is too far away from you, when the Lord your God blesses you, then you shall exchange it for money and bind the money in your hand and go to the place the Lord your God chooses. You may spend the money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen or sheep or wine or strong drink, or whatever your heart desires. And there you shall eat in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice, you and your household. Also you shall not neglect the Levite who is in your town, for he has no portion or inheritance among you. God says when you go to celebrate, take the Levite with you, take care of him, because he's not given land like you were. So there's two problems with this passage here. First is the issue of the tithe. The second is the question as to whether or not the Bible commands total abstinence from alcohol. So let's deal with the hard one first, which is the issue of the tithe. The tithe, which is 10% of your income, is an eternal principle. People often object to the tithe by saying it's the law of Moses, but the tithe existed long before the law of Moses was instituted. Back in Genesis chapter 14, we read of the first tithe in the Bible. Abraham, when he was returning from the slaughter of the kings, paid a tithe, or 10%, to Melchizedek. Jacob promised God that he would give to him the 10th part. So the tithe is eternal, and it belongs to the Lord. Now in this chapter, Deuteronomy 14, the issue is not whether a person should tithe. It is what they should tithe. If they can afford to make the trip, that is to the tabernacle or to the temple, they were to transport 10% of their crops to the tabernacle or the temple, and then they would give them to the priests, and then a portion of that they would be able to eat. But if they could not afford to make the trip, then God commanded them to liquidate 10% of their crops or herds and still make the trip with their families so they could worship the Lord and celebrate alongside their fellow Israelites. They weren't allowed to remain at home and not go and worship the Lord at the place He had designated. So there's really not a whole lot of controversy there. The question is just, what do you bring as an offering? No Israelite was exempted from going to the tabernacle or temple to worship. They had to do it, I believe, at least once a year. Now, I believe God had all the men of Israel appear 4 times a year before the tabernacle, before the presence of the Lord in the tabernacle or the temple. That was a command. So, but I think it was once a year when they would make the journey, and then that's where they would bring their tithes. Now that brings us to the second question here. Does the Bible condemn the use of alcohol as a beverage? Ready for my answer? Okay. The answer is no. It does not. It does condemn, in no uncertain terms, being controlled by alcohol or being drunk. Jesus drank wine. I've heard all the arguments for that Jesus didn't drink actual wine, rather that He just drank freshly squeezed grape juice. That wasn't the case. Okay? He turned water into wine. And if you know the story of the wedding at Cana of Galilee, the wine was so good that the master of ceremonies said, "You saved the best for last." These festivities would go on usually for a week, and they would bring out the expensive wine first, and then as the celebration went on towards the end of the week, they would have to water it down. So as the week got on, the wine went worse. But then when they ran out of wine, Mary says, "Hey, we're out of wine, and it's your time to show them who you are." So he goes, he turns the water into wine, and when they tasted it, the master of ceremonies came out and said, "Wow, this is a different kind of ceremony here. It's the end of the feast, and you saved the best for last." So as a matter of practicality, you never get drunk unless you drink. So the teetotaler position that some churches put forth is not based on Scripture, but it's based on logic. It is recommended that you don't drink, but if you do, don't get drunk. The Bible is clear about the dangers of alcohol. Now, if alcohol becomes something you need every day just to get by, well, then you're becoming addicted and you need to abstain. I read a great leadership book about 14 years ago by George Bush. It was published, I think, 2 years after he was in office, called Decision Points. It's about a 700-page book, and it's one of the best books on leadership I've ever read. In this book, he highlighted the times in his life when he had to make the right decisions. Big life-altering decisions, like the time on 9/11 when the plane went off communications and was headed towards Los Angeles, and the other planes had already slammed into the World Trade Center, and he had to dispatch the fighters that if they cross a certain line, that you have to shoot this plane down. And in his mind, he kept wrestling, I can't let it hit buildings in Los Angeles. At the same time, I don't want to shoot down a plane full of innocent people. And you know what he said he did? He said he prayed. And the plane's communications came back online, and they were having trouble. But he said, I knew what I had to do. And what I took away from that as a leader is that, sometimes you don't have the benefit of having good options. Sometimes being a leader means you have to make a hard decision, and you don't have good options to choose from. You just try to choose the less worse option. But if you read his book, you'll see that he said that the biggest decision in his life, this is, I think, chapter 1, was his decision to quit drinking. He told the story about being at a fundraiser with his dad when he was young, and he got so drunk that he got behind the microphone and he told an off-color joke, and the joke went flat. The audience didn't think it was funny, and he looked over at his mom and dad, and they just dropped their heads in embarrassment. Later, he told the story that he came in one evening and he took out the mailbox because he was driving while intoxicated. And he said that his dad never said a word to him. His dad was reading the paper, and he says he lowered the paper and lowered his glasses. And he said, that look that my dad gave me was the worst thing he could ever done. Next day, his dad got on the phone with Billy Graham, and the two of them had a sit down, and that was when he made the decision to quit drinking alcohol. But it's a great story. Here's another piece of advice about drinking. You have the liberty to drink alcohol, okay? But you don't have the liberty to offend a weaker brother. So if there's someone who's struggling with alcohol addiction, then read Romans chapter 14. And when you're around that person, don't create a stumbling block in their path. Don't let your liberty be the reason they fall back into addiction. Okay? Any questions about that? Well, I mean, some addictions you could just flat out say are sinful. Pornography, there's no liberty for that. Okay, that's adultery. That's lust. Any other addictions you have? I mean, can you give me a specific?
Well, like obviously drug related.
Drug related, I would say, just because, and I know what's coming here is a question about marijuana. Because I've talked to people. Jordan? I would say if somebody's a gambling addict, probably I'd stay as far away from that as possible. In the discussions I've had, going back to marijuana, because marijuana is a huge thing right now. People say, well, we went through prohibition and that didn't work. Why are we now practicing prohibition towards marijuana? Well, the difference is and this is my opinion, okay? I'm not reading gospel here, okay? The difference between alcohol and marijuana is that with marijuana, you smoke one joint and your decision-making ability is immediately impaired. Plus, we know that hard drug use follows marijuana. It's the gateway drug. Alcohol, you can enjoy the product a while before it actually takes you. There's a definite line that can be crossed. And that's why I think that it's not sinful for Christians to drink alcohol, but I think we need to use extreme caution. I mean, people say, does the Bible condemn alcoholic beverages? No, it does not. The Bible doesn't condemn debt, but it warns against it. The Bible doesn't condemn a lot of things that it warns against. So, I mean, your example, Jordan, I think is pretty. I think you always just have to look, is this particular activity I'm going to engage in, even though I have liberty to do it, is it going to cause somebody else to stumble? That's the principle of Romans 14. Any further questions? Okay. Deuteronomy chapter 20. This is the big one. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 16. When you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer it terms of peace. If it agrees to make peace with you and opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall become your forced labor and shall serve you. Okay, so this isn't going to be a discussion about slavery. We don't have time to get into that, but we will. However, if it does not make peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. When the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall strike all the men in it with the edge of the sword. Only the women and the children and the animals and all that is in the city, all its spoil, you shall take as booty for yourself, and you shall use the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. Thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not of the cities of these nations nearby. Only in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God has given you as inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes, but you shall utterly destroy them. And then he lists these people. These are people that you don't make peace with, you don't even offer them peace. The Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that they may not teach you to do according to all their detestable things which they have done for their gods, so that you would sin against the Lord your God. So here's the million-dollar question is, does God command genocide? This is probably the passage that most skeptics of the Bible, most secular champions, will throw at the believer. You worship a God that gave an order for Moses and Joshua to kill children. Okay, so the question is this what God is commanding? And the answer is no. Because the answer here is similar to the distinction between murder and killing. Murder is the deliberate taking of an innocent human life. But we know it's okay to kill in certain cases, such as war or self-defense. This war that took place in Canaan was total war. The inhabitants of Canaan represented a threat to God's plan of redemption. To allow any vestige of their culture to remain gravely endangered God's plan of salvation, which would come through whom? The Jewish nation. This wasn't genocide because the inhabitants of Canaan weren't innocent. They were demon-possessed at both the individual and the cultural level. Now let me read to you an article, and I just want to give you fair warning, okay? I'm going to get pretty graphic here. There's no children here we have babies. Okay, I don't think they'll understand what I'm saying. But we're going to get pretty graphic here. I've gone through this article and highlighted the parts I'm going to read because I cannot read the entire article, not in mixed company. But this talks about the levels of depravity of Canaanite culture, okay? God tells Israel in Deuteronomy 9:3 that it was not because of your righteousness or your integrity, but on account of the wickedness of these nations that he was driving out the Canaanites. The Bible is unambiguous concerning what sins they committed, including idolatry, incest, adultery, child sacrifice, homosexuality, and bestiality. Well, let's cover each of these aspects. Idolatry is not some mere individualistic, private religious hobby that a person does. For example, he committed an act of idolatry. To the contrary, it can form an entire group identity and a way of life because those who commit idolatry do so as a result of being idolatrous. Idolatry is a form of worship because it involves ascribing attention and affection to something considered worthy. So worship, regardless of its object, inescapably is whole life formational. Moreover, the concept of idolatry lends itself to a polytheistically formed mentality and culture that has pervasive social consequences. In such a context, worshiping the one true God is a morally, culturally, and socially impersuasive, if not also a repulsive ideal. Within polytheism, a person cannot be idolatrous. If polytheism were true, it would not make any sense in what way someone or some act should be considered idolatrous. Moreover, a follower of polytheism can happily engage in falsehoods. For example, worshiping deities that are contradictory or calling something otherwise unnatural natural. For example, bestiality, which is evidenced by Canaanite culture. The Canaanites take seriously the testimony of the Old Testament witness of Yahweh and his revelation, if for no other reason than to intentionally transform the scriptural depiction of Yahweh into a castrated weakling. In his dissertation for the University of Chicago, Ulf Oldenburg sums up the formational consequences of Canaanite polytheism. And I quote, "By the time of the Hebrew Exodus, Baal had already usurped El's power in Canaan. When in Canaanite religion, El lost the dynamic strength expressed in his name, he lost himself. Most Ugaritic texts describe him as a poor weakling, a coward who abandons justice to save his own skin, and the contempt of the goddesses. One text depicts El as a drunkard, plashing in his own excrement and urine after a banquet. So if polytheism is a way of being idolatrous, even though within polytheism being idolatrous looks odd and incoherent, would it be surprising that idolatry can negatively affect a person's capability to appraise responsibly? Under such influence, divine jealousy and hatred for idolatry can even look like the result of a needy, divine inferiority complex, even when that is not the case, or commands against idolatry can sound like the result of a cosmic killjoy who is a busybody bent on controlling free creatures and their pleasures, even though that is not the intention of the divine being. Idolatry ends up mugging people with a delusion, even in the face of available evidence to the contrary. I think Richard Dawkins exemplifies this confusion when he complains that God's monumental rage whenever his chosen people flirted with a rival god resembles so much as sexual jealousy of the worst kind. But does anyone think that if Dawkins' wife left him for a gingerbread man of her own baking, and then she began to tell everyone that he liked to play with his own excrement and bathe in his own urine, that Dawkins would tolerate the characteristic of his feelings as no more than the sexual jealousy of the worst kind? Seriously, though, I've tried to show that Canaanite idolatry, as evidenced by its polytheism, was not some petty, individualistic private affair. That mentality was theologically conducive to, if not motivated by, the formation of Canaanite practices, including the practices of incest, adultery, child sacrifice, homosexuality, and bestiality, such as these practices are not incoherent with Canaanite idolatry. So idolatry is what opens the door for these other practices culturally. Now let's go through these one by one, and here's where it's going to get a little graphic. The first is incest. Like all ancient Near East pantheons, the Canaanite pantheon was incestuous. The god El, considered to be the father of the gods, had 70 children by Asherah. From that union came Baal and his sister Anan, with whom Baal had sexual relations. After Baal reported to his father El that Asherah had tried to seduce him, El encouraged Baal to have sex with her to humiliate her, which Baal did. Baal also had as a consort his first daughter, Pidre. None of these incestuous acts of the gods is presented pejoratively. Although early Canaanite laws prescribed either death or banishment for most forms of incest, after the 4th century BC, the penalties were reduced to no more than payment of a fine. This decriminalization of incest coincided with the centuries between God's word to Abraham that the sins of those who lived there had not yet reached their full measure, and the Exodus. By delaying judgment, God expressed patience and demonstrated that his judgment is neither capricious nor unwarranted. Now, even though the rest of the ancient Near East may have legislated against incest, after all, it does result in deformed children, that doesn't mean that incestuous fantasies were considered abhorrent. For example, consider the Egyptian dream book written for men that lists many types of dreams and omens associated with incest. It begins with, if a man sees himself in a dream having intercourse with his mother, that's good. His companions will stick to him. Having intercourse with his sister, good. It means that he will inherit something. Having intercourse with a woman, bad. It means mourning. Now remember that Sodom was likewise a Canaanite city, and after it was destroyed for its wickedness, the next thing we read is that Lot's daughters get him drunk, and what do? They have sex with him. Lot and his daughters imitate the sexual practices of Canaanite cultures, and the Canaanites imitate the practices of their deities. So you see where this is going? You become what you worship. You take on their qualities. That's why idolatry is so sinful. That's why God emphatically says, you shall have no other gods before me. Let's move on to the second sin, adultery. Canaanite religion, like that of all the ancient Near East, was a fertility religion that involved temple sex. By the way, there's a great book out called The Return of the Gods by Jonathan Cahn. Anybody read it? Have you read it, Doug? Anybody else read it? Talks about how these gods seemingly disappeared for a while and now they have resurfaced here in America in various ways. It's a real quick read. It's only a couple of hundred pages, but you should get it and read it. It's called Return of the Gods by Jonathan Cahn. Inanna, or Ishtar, also known as the Queen of Heaven, became the woman among the gods, the patron of eroticism and sensuality, of conjugal love, as well as adultery, of brides and prostitutes, transvestites, and pederasts. Jonathan Tubb, curator of Syria-Palestine within the Western Asiatic Department of the British Museum, points out that according to texts from Ugarit, the practice of the cult involved priests drawn from priestly families and also sacred prostitutes, both male and female. Tubb says that Anat was promiscuous, and El seduced two women who gave birth to dawn and dusks. Now, the priests probably attended to their rituals totally naked, and sex was certainly a large part of their ceremonies. As University of Helsinki professor Marni Nissanen writes, sexual contact with a person whose whole life was devoted to the goddess was tantamount to union with the goddess herself. The story of El having sex with two women or goddesses ends up with two directions, to be repeated 5 times by the company and singers of the assembly. About this, John Gray comments that we may well suppose that this activity of El was sacramentally experienced by the community in the sexual orgies of the fertility cult, which the Hebrew prophets so vehemently denounced. You starting to see the clearer picture here as to why God said, you can't allow any vestige of this culture to survive. You have to kill everything that breathes. Now, this is not to say that adultery was not against the law. Largely, though, it applied only to married women. For the man, it was no offense to have sex with an unmarried woman. Adultery was then an offense not against a man's own wife, but against the husband of the guilty woman, and he could condone it and accept compensation, but mere fornication was no offense in a man, whether married or unmarried. There was then almost absolute liberty for the husband, but not for the wife. Lisa Manashay, professor of Egyptology at the University of Copenhagen, points out that in Egypt, adultery flourished in the lower classes. Gwendolyn Lick, a Syriology researcher at the University of the Arts of London, writes that in Mesopotamia, where all sexual behavior was under the auspices of the goddess Inanna Ishtar, sexual acts outside of marriage could be condoned and to some extent even institutionalized. The goddess is linked with prostitution in several compositions. Of course, there's no reason to suppose that the Canaanites, situated between Egypt and Mesopotamia, were not doing likewise. Let's move on to the third one, which is child sacrifice. Leviticus 18:21 commands, do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech. Molech was a Canaanite underworld deity represented as an upright, bull-headed idol with a human body in whose belly a fire was stoked and in whose outstretched arms a child was placed that would be burned to death. It was not just unwanted children who were sacrificed. Plutarch, Roman historian, reports that during the Phoenician sacrifices, the whole area before the statue was filled with a loud noise of flutes and drums, so that the cries of the wailing should not reach the ears of the people. And it was not just infants. Children as old as 4 were sacrificed. Plutarch says that the Phoenicians, and especially the Carthaginians who honored Kronos, whenever they wished to succeed in any great enterprise, would vow by one of their children that if they achieved the things they longed for, to sacrifice him to a god. A bronze image of Kronos was set up among them, stretching out its cupped hands above a bronze cauldron, which would burn the child. As the flame burning the child surrounded the body, the limbs would shrivel up, and the mouth would appear to grin as if laughing until it was shrunk enough to sink into the cauldron. Oxford professor John Day wrote, in fact, we have independent evidence that child sacrifice was practiced in the Canaanite world from many classical sources. Punic inscription and archaeological evidence, as well as Egyptian depictions of the ritual occurring in Syria and Palestine, and from a recently discovered Phoenician inscription in Turkey. Therefore, there is no reason to doubt the biblical testimony to child sacrifice. Now, there are some who object to this, but there's simply not room here to fully answer their charges that the Israelites did not believe that Yahweh disapproved of child sacrifice. Clay says, I must at least mention his comments regarding Jephthah in Judges chapter 11, because a particular author completely misses the point. Are you familiar with the story of Jephthah in Judges chapter 11? Before he went to battle, he made a vow to the Lord and said that if he wins the battle, he would sacrifice whatever came out of his front door. So he wins the battle, and his daughter steps out of the front door, and the Bible says that he goes and does with her as he had vowed. Some think that he dedicated her to the temple for a life of service, but it was very obvious in the Hebrew what he meant, that he was going to kill and offer as a burnt offering on the altar. Now, this was during the time of the judges, okay? In those days, Israel had no king. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. There were ways he could have gotten out of that vow. He could have gone to the priest. In the law of God, if you made a vow you couldn't keep, there were ways you could get out of it. That's what Jephthah should have done. But in the whole context of Judges, it made perfect sense that he would do something that bizarre. But what you read about in the book of Judges is what happened when the Israelites did not obey God and completely wipe out the Canaanites. They began to take on their practices. Now, the fourth behavior that was common in Canaanite culture was homosexuality. Although we have little from Ugarit about homosexual practice, the Old Testament tells us that the Canaanites practiced it, and no ancient Near East text condemns it. Additionally, some texts show there were those in the temple for use by the same sex. Here's one of their poems. Even Uruk, the dwelling of Anu and Ishtar, city of prostitutes, courtesans, and call girls, whom Ishtar deprived of husbands and kept in her power, Sutian men and women hurt their abuse. They rouse Iana, the party boys and festival people, who changed their masculinity into femininity to make the people of Ishtar reveal her. From the Babylonian magical text, pre-7th century BC, we read the following omens. If a man has intercourse with the hindquarters of his equal, male, that man will be foremost among his brothers and colleagues. If a man yearns to express his manhood while in prison and thus, like a male cult prostitute, mates with men becoming his desire, he will experience evil. If a man has intercourse with a cult prostitute, troubles will leave him. Again, let us remember that the Canaanite city of Sodom, that the problem was not just sex among consenting adults. The men of Sodom, both young and old, joined together to try to rape the angels. Now, the last sin we're going to talk about is bestiality, because probably the ultimate depravity is sex with animals. Hittite Law 199 states, if anyone has intercourse with a pig or a dog, he shall die. If a man has intercourse with a horse or a mule, there's no punishment. And as was the case with incest, the penalty for having sex with animals lessened about the time of the Exodus from Egypt. There should be no surprise that bestiality would occur for the Canaanites, since the gods they worship practiced it. From the Canaanite epic Baal cycle, we learn, mightiest Baal hears. He makes love with a heifer in the outback, a cow in the field of death's realm. He lies with her 70 times 7, mounts 80 times 8. She conceives and bears a boy. So in short, to sum up Canaanite practices, their sexual fantasies involved everything that breathed. Now, if this evidence is sound, then it turns out that Yahweh's command to kill in certain cities everything that breathes is responsive to the actual perversion found in ancient Near East practices. Thus, he disagrees. There's a guy who wrote a book, Paul Copan, called Is God a Moral Monster?, in which he takes issue with the fact that God actually commanded Israel to kill everything that breathes, when he's saying this language is hyperbolic. If they were having sex with just about every living thing they could get their hand on, and they were, then all of them had to die. Richard Dawkins, who's a prolific atheist of our time, objects that it adds injury to insult that the unfortunate beast is to be killed too. But what Dawkins and others do not grasp is that no one would want to have animals around that were used to having sex with humans. And then he gives some stories here which I won't go into because they're pretty graphic. Let's talk a little bit about our sin. A cursory read of at least the ideas current in American culture often reads like a sequel to Canaanite practices. Of course, it is not as though people with Canaanite ancestry who happen to live in the United States are the culprits writing the sequel. Indeed, the sequel gets written in every generation, regardless of culture, ethnicity, or people group. It persistently gets written because it flows from the human heart and its condition. But perhaps hypocrisy, with all of its rationalizing potency, does not help us see the heart and its real condition clearly. For example, this article was written back in 2009. In a culture that gravitates to desperate housewives, adultery websites like Ashley Madison's, which boasted over 3,180,000 members, leads with a motto, "Life is short, have an affair." This, of course, does not trouble enlightened atheists. Dawkins writes that we humans give ourselves such airs, even aggrandizing our poky little sins to the level of cosmic significance. Dawkins asks why evangelical Christians are obsessed with private sexual inclinations such as homosexuality, which didn't interfere with anybody else's life, and the apparently not obsessed Christopher Hitchens considers dangerous sexual repression so serious that he calls it one of the 4 irreducible objections to religious faith. Thus, Judith Levine, in her 2002 Los Angeles Times book, prize winner, Harmful to Minors, The Perils of Protecting Children from Sex, argues that normal is what a particular culture or historical era calls it. Male homosexuality was regarded as normal in classical Greece. Intergenerational sex has been normal as sexual initiation in many pre-industrial societies. Even rape has been considered acceptable in some cultures. Well, consider the problem of incest. Although no one I know actively advocates incest, this was back in 2009. We're in 2024 now, and there are people who advocate it. Some, like Levin, say that some type of incest might not be harmful, and many others seek the age of consent to be decreased. It's happening right now as we speak. They're wanting to lower the age of consent, which would enable more incest. After all, if an 8-year-old boy can give a non-family member consent, he could give a family member consent. There's even a forum for people who are engaged in a scholarly discussion about the understanding and emancipation of mutual relationships between children or adolescents and adults. Many popular movies have turned incest into either a joke or a turn-on. So it's no wonder that in our society, research indicates that 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 10 boys will be sexually victimized before adulthood. Now, I could read on more, but needless to say, I think you get a more clear picture here that the Canaanites were not innocent. They've been given 400 years to repent. But there's another angle that I want to close with, and that is, if you read Tim Chaffee's book, Fallen, the Sons of God and the Nephilim, I'm going to talk a lot about that this coming Sunday. You'll see that all of these people groups that God singled out for absolute destruction, all were descended from the Nephilim, which means they didn't even have the image of God. These people were not even human. I know it's hard for us to imagine, but as I'm going to explain Sunday in Genesis chapter 6, at that time you had beings living on the earth that were not fully human. They were part angelic, part human. They did not have the image of God. So that changes the dynamic entirely. I've never accepted any explanation for Israel going into the promised land and killing the children. The explanations that I've seen are horrible. I've seen one very well-known theologian say that, well, if they hadn't yet reached the age of accountability, then all the children would go to heaven. Okay? Do you realize where that leads you? That leads you to a justification for abortion. A woman could say, hey, I have no money, I have no job, I have no husband. This baby would be better off in heaven. Let me just go have an abortion. That's a horrible explanation. And God clearly said over and over in the scriptures that you don't punish the righteous with the wicked. I mean, he was even willing to spare all of the cities of the plain if the angels could just find 10 righteous people. but they couldn't find 10 righteous people. That's how great the mercy of God is. And so when I believe you read this, I think you have to factor in who these people were. These weren't human beings bearing the image of God. These were demonic human offspring whose total purpose was to corrupt the human DNA pool and thwart the plan of God for salvation. I mean, after all, the plan of salvation came through a woman, right? Genesis 3:15, the proto-evangelium. God says that I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. You'll bruise him on the heel, but he'll crush your head. That was the first gospel. So Satan in the Garden of Eden, in the form of a serpent, he's over there thinking, okay, this is God's plan. Now I have to counter that plan. And what does he do? He sends his fallen angel cohorts to take on human form and corrupt the seed of humanity. And that ultimately led to God having to take drastic measures, which was the flood. Now, as I'll explain Sunday, this happens again. And that's where the giant clans, if you look at where these giant clans, these groups of people were stationed, they were stationed at a specific entrance to the land of Canaan. The devil did not want God's chosen people possessing that land. And so they had to wipe these people out, which they did in some cases, other cases not. So any questions? If you would like this article, I can get you a copy of it. If you want to read the whole thing, just be warned, there's some things in here that'll probably keep you awake at night. Sometimes I think the less you know, the better off you are. But, when people ask, well, why did God command genocide? Hopefully now you can give them a little bit of an answer. I mean, can you imagine a culture so demonized that the ritual abuse and murder of children is legal? I mean, not just the sacrifice, but the abuse. Can you imagine a culture where incest is so prevalent? We know from the Ugaritic texts that you had a lot of deformed children walking around. I mean, this was a walking nightmare of a culture. So, any other questions? Okay, next week we'll finish up Deuteronomy and we'll get into the book of Joshua. Thanks for attending tonight.